A proposal by the Biden administration aims to remove medical bills from credit reports. In this Watching Your Wallet, consumer investigator Rachel DePompa takes a look at the proposal and what it could mean to millions when it comes to their credit score.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB, is proposing a new rule that would prevent credit reporting agencies from sharing medical debt information with lenders. If adopted, the agency says 15 million Americans with a collective $49 billion in medical debt on their reports could see a 20-point rise in their credit scores. Elizabeth Renter with NerdWallet looked over the proposal and says the people most likely to be impacted by this new rule, should it take effect, are those carrying the highest typical medical debt.
This includes people who have gone periods throughout the year without health insurance, people who had a hospital stay, and people who have high ongoing expenses, like those living with a chronic illness. The CFPB recognizes that people don't often take on medical debt by choice. This isn't like taking out a car loan. Something happens in your life, you have to go to the hospital, and there's a bill that results from that.
NerdWallet recommends reaching out to medical providers if you're having a hard time keeping up with bills.
By reaching out to them and being frank about what you can afford each month, you might find that they're willing to work out a payment arrangement that's more easy to tolerate. In some cases, if you're able to make a large payment, they could even be willing to negotiate on the total amount that you owe.
Renter says medical debt can impact your credit score when trying to qualify for a home loan, a car loan, even credit cards. So she says tackling medical debt when you can is key, and this is just a proposed rule. So if it is finalized by the CFPB, that likely wouldn't happen until sometime next year. With this Watching Your Wallet, I'm Rachel DePompa.